حياكم الله من قرأ سورة المباركة الفاتحة. بسم الله الرحمن الرحيم. صلى الله عليك يا سيدي ويا مولاي يا رسول الله. صلى الله عليك يا سيدي ويا مولاي يا أبا عبد الله. طبتم وطابت الأرض التي فيها دفنتم سيدي. فيا ليتنا كنا معكم سيدي فنفوز والله فوزا عظيما. صلوات الله صل وآل محمد. بسم الله الرحمن الرحيم، والصلاة والسلام على أفضل الأنبياء والمرسلين بارئ الخلائق أجمعين سيدنا وسندنا وشفيعنا مولانا وحبيب قلوبنا أبي القاسم محمد. اللهم صل على محمد وعلى بيته الطيبين الطاهرين المعصومين المظلومين الذين اصطفاهم الله أجمعين. أما بعد، فقد قال الله تعالى في محكم كتابه الكريم وقوله الحق وهو أصدق الصادقين. بسم الله الرحمن الرحيم. ومن يبتغي غير الإسلام دينا فلن يقبل منه. صدق الله العلي العظيم. صلوات على محمد وآل محمد. اللهم صل على محمد ومحمد. My respected elders, my respected brothers and sisters, I bid you all assalamu alaikum wa rahmatullahi wa barakatuh. I'd like to continue from the discussion which we started yesterday with regards to religion not being an imposed force, but a reality which exists within us. And it's a reality which is meant to be brought out, and it's meant to be brought out and to be understood. And the way this reality is brought out has a huge effect on the way you and I understand religion and the way we discuss it. Because we came to a conclusion yesterday that it's not that you and I are evil or unequals, or that we are born evil and we are waiting for religion or a force to make us good. Rather, we are born with a greatness that Allah has given us, and it's within us. And religion is there to aid us and to say to us, how can I become better, greater than I already am? And hence when the Quran comes, as we discussed, and says, فَذَكِّرْ, and remind them, the question that we asked is, what is the messenger meant to remind us? Is he meant to remind us of something which we don't already know? Because a reminder, in essence, is meant to be you understanding something which you already know or you already have. And hence what we came to a conclusion with is that when Allah in the Quran says remind them, He is saying bring out that reality which was instilled to them and which was given to them. And that in essence is the reality of what Islam is. Islam is not the name of simply a religion or a specific sect of people which exists today. But Islam is the name of a reality which existed ever since the time of Adam and is continuous till today. It's a reality of the best solutions and the best systems to the issues which society has and faces today. On a general level, on a greater level, that's what Islam is. And hence we come to say that our Islam is much past labels. We're much past the level of labeling the religion. What we're trying to say is, if you examine the Holy Quran, Allah says in one of the verses, Bismillah ar-Rahman ar-Rahim, your father Abraham, Abakum Ibrahim, Sammakum Muslimun, your father Abraham named you Muslims. The question that we ask in today's discussion, it's a crucial question which is going to jumpstart the discussion for today and tomorrow, is that if Abraham named us Muslims, then prior to Abraham, what religion was existent and what label was there? Because if Ibrahim gave us the name Islam, if Ibrahim told us what Islam is, there is a reality which is here to be questioned, that what religion or what title existed before him. And that's what we want to reach today. That's what we're trying to understand. Now if we examine the Quranic exegesis, it's quite interesting. Because when we look at the story of Adam, Shaitan and God once again, you'll find that Allah speaks about religion in two different forms. One form of religion is this form which is meant to be a noun. It's the outer garb and the name of the religion. And there's a deeper, more strong emphasis on a form of religion which is known as the verb of religion. It's the actual movement, the do's and does of what religion tells us. And it's much past the outer shell or the outer label. And a lot of the time we see it from an outer label. Now, let me kind of give a brief example. If we look at the Holy Quran, and we look at the conversation between Allah Azza wa Jal, Shaitan and the angels, Shaheed Mutahhari brings out a quite profound point in his book Islam and Religious Pluralism. And he talks about the religion of Islam being something much greater than a noun which we see from the outside. But there's greatness in it, and he speaks about this in this example. When Allah orders the angels to bow down to Adam, and they bow down to Adam and Shaitan refuses, Shaitan starts to speak to Allah Azza wa Jal. And you'll find that many of us sitting here have a preconceived notion of what it means to be religious, or what it means to be part of a religious institution or part of a religion. And this story in the Quran completely shatters that preconceived notion. Because all of a sudden, religion does not only constitute certain beliefs, but the asset of action brings a very big part into the reality of what religion is meant to be. If we look at the Quranic exegesis and we look at this story very closely, you'll find that Shaitan speaks to Allah Azza wa Jal and says to him, فَبِعِزَّتِكَ لَأَغْوِيَنَّهُمْ أَجْمَعِينَ. By your greatness, I will move them all astray, إِلَّا عِبَادَكُ مِنْهُمُ الْمُخْلَصِينَ. Now, the first pillar of Tawheed is being observed here. He is swearing to God by His greatness. He believes a God exists. He's swearing to Him by His greatness. And he's saying, فَبِعِزَّتِكَ لَأَغْوِيَنَّهُمْ أَجْمَعِينَ إِلَّا عِبَادَكَ مِنْهُمُ الْمُخْلَصِينَ. Only those of your servants whom you have purified. Now, there's a side note here, because this specific word, مُخْلَصِينَ, refers to prophethood and imamat from the mouth of Shaitan. That in this verse, what he's trying to say is this. What he's trying to say is, in the Arabic language, the word mukhlas is different than the word mukhlas. Mukhlas in the Arabic language means you are purified by an outside force. Mukhlas with a fatha. Mukhlas with a kasra is self-purified. I purify myself because I am mukhlas. The Shaitan here is telling Allah, there are individuals which I cannot touch and I cannot tempt. And these individuals are mukhlas, meaning you have purified them and they have not purified themselves. And this is a reference in the Quran to imamat and prophethood from the discussion of Shaitan himself. Now, there's a belief here that there are individuals by Shaitan who believe in imamat and prophethood. Let's go further than that. He continued the discussion with Allah Azza wa Jalla, and he says to him, فَبِعِزَّتِكَ لَأَغْوِيَنَّهُمْ أَجْمَعِينَ إِلَّا عِبَادَكَ مِنْهُمُ الْمُخْلَصِينَ. And he says, فَانْذُرْنِي إِلَى يَوْمِ يُبْعَثُونَ. Let me live until the day that they are resurrected. Meaning there's a belief here in the day of judgment. Now in the first verse, he believes in Allah Azza wa Jalla. In the second verse, he's speaking about imamat and prophethood. In the third verse, he's speaking about the day of judgment. He says to Allah, save me and let me live to the day of judgment. Now some historians have a difference when it comes to this narration. They say that this narration is speaking about Imam Mahdi and Imam Mahdi's reappearance. And some fuqaha say no. Here he is hinting to the day of judgment. Let me live until the day they are resurrected. Interestingly enough, the conversation continues. And Allah in the following verse says about Shaitan, he says, إِنَّهُ مِنَ الْكَافِرِينَ. He is of the disbelievers. The question that we pose here is this. What is the reality of submission and saying that I am part of a religion, or I am a religious person, or I am a Muslim? What does this even mean when we say something like this? Because a lot of the time there's a stigma that the minute I believe in this and this, I am constituted as a Muslim, and that's enough for me to say I'm a Muslim. But Islam is such a deeper reality than the empty outer garb or shell which we have seen, that this verse is telling us just because you label yourself something or you believe in something does not mean you are a Muslim as you think you are, because Islam is something much greater. See, what we're trying to get to here is we're trying to differentiate the noun Islam versus the form or the submission Islam, which is the greatest form of Islam. It's the verb. And this is what we're going to get to today. But it's important that we understand and realize that without really bringing up such topics and without really questioning the reality of our existence, you and I will not reach a state of difference. Take an example around us here. Many of us sitting here, if it was not for our Hindu forefathers, we would not be here today embracing the religion of Islam. If it was not for their guts and their abilities to question the very systems that they lived by and the very things which they believed in, and these forefathers challenging the deities that they lived by and saying, you know what, there's something about my life which doesn't make sense. I've got a gut feeling, and I'm human enough to say, can I ask you a question? Can I challenge what I have today? Is it okay for me to say, explain this to me further, or let me understand this better? Because if it was not for their guts and their abilities to be human enough with themselves, we probably wouldn't be here today. And that's the reality that we're trying to get to here. Now, this very questioning process is important because within the religion of Islam, everything is based on a concept of logic. There is reasoning and understanding behind why we believe what we believe. Yes, faith is existent in certain areas, but on a general basis, faith is not the interpretation of believing in something without any logical proof. No, faith is not that. See, sometimes we have this preconceived notion that there is either logic or faith, where I believe in something because I can logically derive it, or I have faith where I have things which I cannot logically derive, or I have no understanding or proof for, but I can still believe in those things. And the two words mean something much greater than what we're saying here, and I'm going to get to this in just a second. But when we look at it, when we examine our reality, there's a sense of logic to our reality. Take, for example, a very basic notion. Those who are in university today know very well that take a logic class, or take a philosophy class, or take a university class, and it's kind of impossible in our world today to go through a university education and to come out without any questions. It's almost impossible. It's almost impossible to go to university and go within a logic class or to speak to a militant atheism because we live in a society which is completely diverse. There's an openness in discussion. I can have a militant atheist sitting to my right in my class. I can have a Christian next to me and a Jew in front of me and a Sikh behind me. We live in a very diverse society to show you where we've come. And it's almost impossible to go through today's modern universities without really coming out and saying, man, I've got a lot of questions, and that's okay. Because a lot of the times, as much as somebody like Richard Dawkins, who's a militant atheism, spreads hate and violence and attacks upon religions, at times I say to myself, if we were not pushed into that corner, would we actually question our faith? If we were not pushed into a corner where we have to reply as Muslims, would we question our faith and what we believe? Would we come up with the arguments for God's existence? And there's a stigma today within the academic world, is that as if there are things which can logically be proven, scientifically be proven, and there are things like God and religion which are faith-based, which have no place in the academic world. And sometimes it's hard to reconcile and say, where do I stand on this topic? Or how can I prove God's existence logically? And at times, if I can't prove God's existence logically, then everything else kind of falls down the drain for me, and I kind of throw out religion to the side, and I start looking at things very differently. Let me give a brief example here. Shahid al-Sadr has a profound book called The Message, the Messenger, and the Revealer. And in this book, he discusses the concept of God and says proving God's existence uses the same scientific method that modern science uses today in order for them to explain their theories and their laws. The same exact method. And he proves it. And he gives this basic example. He says, imagine that one day you're walking outside of your house. And as you are walking outside of your house, you go to a mailbox and you open your mailbox. And as you open it, you find that there's a letter in the mailbox. You take the letter out, and the letter has the name of your brother on it. Now, keep with me on this analogy because it's quite important. He says, you take the letter and you look at it and you say to yourself, wow, my brother's name is on the letter. He says, you open the letter, you take out the content, and you see that it's your brother's address, your brother's name. There are things mentioned in the letter that only your brother knows. There are stamps and gifts and whatever from your brother that your brother had promised you. And Shahid al-Sadr says that I have never seen my brother write the letter. I wasn't witness to it. But the way that I understand this letter is from my brother is that all the signs tell me through inductive probability, there's a very high chance that my brother wrote this letter. Now, What's the probability that this is from some alien imposter who kidnapped my brother, put him on a spaceship, and then wrote the letter and sent it to me? It's a very small chance. Who would take such a probability? The probability for that is so small, and the signs for the probability that my brother has written me this letter are so great that probably this is from my brother. Let's take this to a further example. Take a look at this example, which is the very theory today that the earth was at one point part of the sun. Scientists today believe that our earth was at one point part of the sun. How do we deduce this, and how do we understand it? Well, the way that we do it is scientists say there are such great similarities between the earth and the sun. For example, the earth's axis is very similar to the sun's axis. The earth's rotation speed is similar to the sun's rotation speed. The elements found on the earth are similar to the elements found on the sun. Our earth at one point was very hot, the same way the sun is. And they bring all of these different signs together, and they say that inductively, we've never seen the earth split from the sun, but we can prove through probability that our earth was most likely at one point part of that sun which is here near us. Now, what's the probability of our earth being from a sun very, very far away and distant? Well, it's very small, because we already have a sun next to us which fits all of the criteria and the probabilities. And hence we say that most probably, we've never seen it happen, we've never empirically witnessed it, but we are able to deduce scientifically through probability that all the signs show us our earth was at one point part of the sun. Now, take this example and put it on the God concept, and it fits quite perfectly. It fits very perfectly. Because if you examine our world today, when we look at the creative order that exists in our realms, things moving at a specific rate, our earth being at a specific rate, the way our body moves so perfectly and so meticulously, the way that everything runs together in this universe, the way even the birds interact. Imam As-Sadiq has got quite a profound hadith. And I've mentioned this before, that he's standing next to his companion Mufaddal, and he says to him, Mufaddal, can you examine the bird? He says, yes. He says to him, do you see how the bird has an aerodynamic body? He says, yes. He says, that allows the bird to fly. He says to him, look once again. Do you see how the bird has small feet to fit under its wings? He says, yes. He says to him, these wings allow the bird to have as less air resistance as possible. He says to him, look at the bird once again. Do you see how the bird has hollow bones so that it's not too heavy to fly? He says, yes. He says to him, look once again at the bird. Now, here he's just examining a bird. This isn't like the string theory or the multiverse theory. This is something very basic as a bird. Imam says to him, look again. Do you see how the bird lays its eggs and does not carry its young ones in its stomach? He says, yes. He says to him, this is telling you, and what this is trying to bring to you, O Mufaddal, is that could this universe be a part of an accident where it accidentally appears? And what we're saying here is, what's the probability, let's use a probability argument again, that all of the creativity and the prestige creation in this universe is part of an accident which exists? Michael Corey actually goes through in his book where he speaks about God's existence, and he says, it's called the God Cosmology, and he says, is it possible for God's existence today, or God's non-existence, to be probable? Meaning, what's the probability of my universe to come into existence from an accident? And he says, the number is so small, the number is so minute and tiny, that it has so many zeros where it can go around the earth once. That's how small the probability is. It's pretty much saying that I have a Ferrari, and I'm going to deassemble it, throw it into the air, and watch it come down with all the pieces fitting perfectly next to each other. It's like, what's the probability of that happening every time I throw up all the pieces of the Ferrari? Now, our universe is much more pristine than that. It's much more prestige than that. So what we're saying here is the probability of our creative universe, having a creative creator and a designer, is much higher than the probability of us coming into existence through an accident. Now that's a very logical argument to God's existence. Now all of a sudden, there is some sort of creator which creates me because I see so much designer on me. Now the reason I bring this forward is to try to show us that there are logical and scientific proofs to why we believe what we believe. There is a scientific method to God's existence. It's not something haphazard that I feel like I need to feed the gaps that I have in my life, and the only way that I do it is by accepting a God. No, there's a much more logical reality. But the problem is when we don't ask and we don't acknowledge, that's when things kind of come out of hand and we start to not understand things. Now, the reason I give this example, as I said, is there's a logical interpretation behind it. There's a logical understanding. Now, when we examine religion on a very forefront, these are the questions which are meant to come out. As we mentioned yesterday, that when the Prophet came to the Arabian society, his main interest was not simply to get people to be robotic drones. His main interest was not to simply get to people to pray, fast, and give zakat. But his interest was to allow people to understand the deep roots of why they exist and why they're doing what they're doing. And hence, as we said, some of the earliest things that he said to the Arabians was what? He said to the mankind, 1 hour, thank you, 1 hour of contemplation. 1 hour of contemplation is better than 70 years of dry worship. In other hadith, mankind, an hour of contemplation is better than 1,000 years. Now, his method that he used was interesting. There's an interesting business psychologist by the name of Simon Sinek, who's got a TED Talk which relates this idea very beautifully. He says the way that humans exist, they exist within 3 main different circles, and depending on which circle they focus on, they are the most successful and the most understanding of why they do what they do. He says within business, and this is specifically this is in general to many companies that are out there. He says in business, the way that people market to others is they build 3 circles and they use the 3-circle platform to get other people to understand what they're trying to relay. He says the first main circle is known as the circle of the why. It's why we do what we do. It's why we tell people to do what we want them to do. He says on the second level, you've got the circle of the how. It's the actual process that they go through. He says, and the third outer circle is known as the circle of the what, which is what they are trying to achieve. What's the mechanical action, which will get you to where you want to get. And he says the most successful individuals in life are the ones who focus on the circle of the why. Now let me just give a brief example. Look at a company like Apple. A lot of us sitting here probably have iPhones. Those who are iPhone haters, please don't come get me after the lecture. A lot of us here have iPhones. And the way that Apple markets to us is quite interesting, because Apple will never come to you and say to you that we have got a phone which costs $700. Make sure you're here tomorrow morning at 7 o'clock in front of our Apple store because we want you to come and get it. They will never say that to you. We all know that before the new product comes out, there's a YouTube video with a white screen, the same white screen, and it's always got the millions of hits, and it always starts very similarly. They always start with marketing the why to you. We have a product which is going to revolutionize the way we see the world. There's a vision behind it. You feel like, wow, you want to revolutionize the world. Well, tell me how you're going to do this because I'm really interested. And we get grasped by this very vision and this purpose-driven, like, well, why do you want to do this? And as a group of people, as a society, we're always interested by the reasons why people do what they do. We want to know their purpose. Why do you do this? Hence, children, they always go through this phase where they ask you why about everything. My younger brother is going through this, and every time I do something, he's like, Ali, why do you do this? Because of this. Well, why do you do that? Because of this. Well, how about this? And why do you do this? And the questions don't end. Because there is this purpose-driven reality of why I do what I do. A lot of the times when people do ask why, we give them generic mechanical answers. You do why, or you do this, and the reason behind it is because God will be happy, for example. It's a generic answer. The child or the individual is looking for something much more from you, which really explains the reality of the act and what the act has to do with the world. The second level that we focus on, and the way that some companies will do it, is they'll say to you, we have a vision to change the world. How are we going to do that? Well, we've created a great product, and this product has this type of retina display, it's got this speed, it can hold this much, it does this and this and this and this. The third thing is, what do you want people to do? Well, would you like to buy it? Do you want to be part of this product? This is how much it costs. And the way that they give it to you is a very gradual understanding where they start with the circle of the why. When Rasulullah came to the Arabians, he used the same exact method. His method was, oh people, forget all about the laws that I'm going to give you later. What I'm interested in is for you guys to ask the basic question of why things are happening the way they are. And if you look at the early Muslims, many of them didn't believe because the Prophet gave them salat or siyam. But they believed and they accepted because they saw this message was purpose-driven. Let me give you a brief example. Take a look at the first two martyrs in Islam, Sumayya and Yasir. Ammar ibn Yasir one day walks into the house, he bumps the statue falls onto the ground. His mother says to him, Ammar, this is not like you, the statue fell, you need to pick it up and put it back where it was. And he says to her, Mother, the statue, it can't help itself, can never help me. He says, Ammar, who taught you this? Where are you getting this from? This is a new understanding. What are you talking about? He says to her, Mother, this is what Muhammad is giving us. She says to him, well, what did Muhammad give you today? What's he saying to you? He said to her, today the verse was revealed, وَإِذَا الْمَوْءُودَةُ سُئِلَتْ بِأَيِّ ذَنْبٍ قُتِلَتْ. When the young child which is buried will be asked, what crime have I done to be buried? And sometimes we honestly don't give the reality of the truth. Some narrations would say that they don't even bury the young children, but they would dig long holes for them. And they would throw them in these holes so that when they fall, every bone in their body would break. It was a very gruesome way of killing children. It wasn't normally just burying the child, but they would very gruesomely kill the children. Now the father of Sumayya, when Sumayya heard this verse, she ran out of the room and she started to cry. Now realize, there's nothing really drastic that he had said here. What did he say for her to do this? When he walks out of the room, Ammar looks at his father Yasir. He says to him, Father, did I say anything to offend her? He says to him, no, but know that your mother had 12 sisters before her. That your grandfather, your mother's father, had buried each and every one. And the 12th daughter, when he buried her, she took her hand out of the grave, and from the position where your father was seeing her, his heart broke for her. So he vowed that the next child which I have, I'm not going to bury her. And that next child was your mother Sumayya. After this incident, Sumayya and Yasir hold on to the religion of Islam. And then after that, who were the two people who were the first two martyrs of Islam? Sumayya and Yasir. Mind you, Sumayya here had never met the Prophet. She never sat and talked to him. But what interested her, what grasped her, was this very message which was purpose-driven. I have an issue which exists where women are second-class citizens. Muhammad has got a realistic solution to this issue. I am going to hold on to the message of Muhammad because I believe in his cause. There's an actual message which is being driven here. And that's why some of us, when we come to talk about the Prophet, our understanding is people love the Prophet simply because he was a very good-looking man, or because of his akhlaq. If that was the case, if it was for his looks, then the people should have believed in him when he was 20 and 25, when he was at the peak of his looks, when he looked his greatest, in his youth years. But there was something much deeper than simply his looks. And if it was for his akhlaq, which did bring people forward, which brought people closer to Islam, then the enemies who saw his akhlaq should have believed. But the true believers in the religion of Islam were after the religion because there was a purpose behind it. It was very, very purpose-driven. Now the way that we view it, the way that we see Islam today, and I'm going to get to this in just a second, is that we've taken it and we've made it exclusive, and instead of focusing on the why, we focus much more on the what. Meaning when I have a child and I raise the child, my main mission is not to instill the child with principles and morals and an understanding of why he does things. But I'm more interested in telling the child, make sure you pray this way or that way. Or make sure you observe this rule or that rule. And that's important, don't get me wrong. But what I'm saying is the main and ultimate purpose is to give the child an understanding of why the system exists in the first place. And the reason we show Islam this way is because of an ill notion that Islam is this exclusive force which is mine and not to the whole world. See, when I see Islam as simply a label or a banner towards a specific people, that's when my vision of Islam becomes very limited. Yesterday, the verse that we started off with, Allah says, Bismillah ar-Rahman ar-Rahim, and this is quite a powerful verse. وَمَنْ يَبْتَغِي غَيْرَ الْإِسْلَامِ دِينًا فَلَنْ يُقْبَلَ مِنْهُ. Anyone, وَمَنْ يَبْتَغِي, those who seek other than religion, other than Islam as a religion, God will not accept from them. Now, from the outside, looking at it from the outside, what does this verse mean? Now what I'm trying to get to here is this. To show us that there's a reality in religion which is much past the laws and rules. But there is an actual essence to it which is meant to benefit mankind. Yesterday we talked about Muslims and atheists alike benefiting if they give charity. that there are studies today being done to show that even if an atheist gives charity, God allows that individual and allows his life to be increased. And hence even atheists today who give charity, their lives are increased. Their blood pressures drop, they live happier lives, and hence they live to be longer. What we're saying is Islam is not the name or the definition for specific laws which are placed on people, but it's a system for all of mankind to coexist in order for us to grow together. Here's what I mean by this. Take a look at the verse here which we started off with. Allah says, Bismillah ar-Rahman ar-Rahim. وَمَنْ يَبْتَغِي غَيْرَ الْإِسْلَامِ دِينًا فَمَنْ يُقْبَلَ مِنْهُ. Those who seek other than Islam as a religion, God will not accept from them. From a very outer perspective, from a very outside reality, what does this verse mean? Is Allah saying to us that those who take Islam will be saved, and those who take anything other than Islam will be rejected? What that kind of constitutes to Allah saying is this: there are 7 billion people on the world. How many are Muslims? Let's say there are 2 billion who are Muslims. Is that a fair analysis? 2 billion who are Muslims. An even lesser group, an even smaller group, are maybe Shia Muslims. Let's say there is 800 million or 500 million which are Shia. Let's say a bit more than that. From those 500 million, how many are actually believers and hold on to the religion? An even smaller amount. Is Allah saying in the Quran that all those who hold on to Islam are being saved, and those who hold on to a religion other than Islam, God will shun them and put them away? It's kind of Allah saying that I've asked you as a human society to do your homework on a lined piece of paper, and I want you to bring it to me. Those who bring me their homework on an iPad, I won't accept their homework from them. I'll turn my face away because I told you to write it on a lined piece of paper. Why did you give it to me on an iPad? It's as if Allah is saying that if you do good deeds and you are Muslim, you're saved. If you do good deeds and you are not a Muslim, I will not accept from you. Because the way we've understood the verse is that acceptance here means God accepts or rejects. Yesterday we discussed and said that when Allah says, I will not accept from you or I will reject from you, He's not saying that the notion of God is there and I am here and God will either reject or accept from you. But what God is saying is Islam is the system of submission that you live by. If you abide by the rules, you will grow as a human being. It's got nothing to do with me accepting or rejecting. You can put that to the side. It's not about God accepting or rejecting. What's at stake here is our growth as a human society. So when this verse says, God is saying, those who hold on to a religion other than Islam, I won't accept from them. What is He saying? Is He saying if you do good deeds and you come to me as a society, and you do good deeds, if you haven't held on to the actual banner of Islam, I won't accept from you, I'll turn my face away from you. Or is God saying something deeper here? Is there a deeper reality to this verse than what we see? Now, the reason we are Muslim is because Islam is the complete and the fastest way to Allah Azza wa Jal. But I ask you by Allah, when we examine the Quran and we examine the justice system of Allah, does it make sense for God to say that those of you who have held on to Islam, I will accept from you, and those who have held on to another religion, I will throw you in hell? That means on the Day of Judgment, the majority of God's creation is going to hell because majority are not Muslim. Is that what God is trying to say to us? Or perhaps there's something deeper which He's trying to give us. Perhaps He's saying that those of you who hold on to Islam, which is the verb, the submission of Islam, to what Islam really means and to what it symbolizes and understands, those who hold on to the reality of Islam, those are the successful and I will accept from them. I will accept from them in the idea that you will grow as a human being. Because is our notion of God as empty as God saying, is God as petty to say that if you give me your homework on a lined piece of paper, I'll take it. But if you give it to me on an iPad, I won't accept it. At the end of the day, what we're saying, and what Allah is trying to say in this verse, is there's something much past the simple banner of religion that makes a human and gives them worth. Look at the verse in the Quran. Allah says, Bismillah ar-Rahman ar-Rahim. The most profound verse which expounds this idea further. Allah says, Bismillah ar-Rahman ar-Rahim. وَمَنِ يَا أَيُّهَا النَّاسِ, O you who believe. إِنَّا خَلَقْنَاكُمْ يَا أَيُّهَا النَّاسِ, O people, not O you who believe, O people. إِنَّا خَلَقْنَاكُمْ مِنْ ذَكَرٍ وَأُنْثَى وَجَعَلْنَاكُمْ شُعُوبًا وَقَبَائِلَ لِتَعَارَفُوا إِنَّ أَكْرَمَكُمْ عِنْدَ اللَّهِ أَتْقَاكُمْ. O people, O mankind. There's a general discussion to all of humanity. A general discussion to all of humanity. Those of you who believe, those of you, O mankind, أَيُّهَا النَّاسِ إِنَّا خَلَقْنَاكُمْ, we've created you from male and female, and we've made you tribes and people that you may come together. The best amongst you are the most God-conscious. Now God's discussion here is to all of humanity. He's saying, O people, the best among you are those who are most conscious to Allah, which is the truth. They are the most conscious to God's understandings. They are the ones who follow the system of God. And hence when the messenger comes forward and he expounds on this hadith, he's got quite a phenomenal hadith where he says this. He says, a Christian king who is kind to his people is better than a Muslim king who's unkind to his people. What a hadith. The Christian king who is kind to his people is better than a Muslim king who's unkind to his people. What he's trying to say is just because you've held on to this banner of Islam does not mean you are a saved individual. We know within our religion, there are individuals within the history of our religious books who've held on to the so-called noun of Islam, but their actions are the furthest thing away from Islam, hurting the Prophet and his family. These exist within our religion today, don't they? Now perhaps what the Prophet, what the verse is trying to say is there is a system which exists in the universe. And if you hold on to the system of truth, then you will be rewarded by what you do. Take a look at the very example of Imam Mahdi coming. عَجَلَ اللَّهُ تَعَالَى فَرَجَهُ الشَّرِيفُ. At times we lose sight of this inclusivity of religion or of Islam. We bring out notions that say, for example, that when Imam appears, he's going to take any non-Muslim, Jew or Christian or atheist, and he's going to be butchering them and killing them left and right, and there will be blood up to the knees. If the very man whose grandfather came as a mercy to society, who took the people from the depths of hell and raised them, who Allah says in the Quran, you fight your battles not only for the mosques but for the synagogues and the temples. Do you think the manifestation of that message, which is his grandson, is going to come to butcher all the people? Does that make sense today? Does it make sense today that when the Imam comes to us, there is only one religion, the whole world will be Islam? Because as we know, within the time of the Prophet, there were people of different religions. In today's world, there are no two Muslims who are alike. There are no two Christians who are alike. There are no two Jews who are alike. What we're saying is there's a reality much past the very label of religion. And that reality is the human reality. Islam is not only the name of a religion which exists, but it's the name to the submission which is the reality which exists amongst us today. Which is the reality of human goodness. That's Islam. That at the deepest level is what Islam is meant to be. And hence if you look at Imam Hussein alayhi salam, Allahumma salli ala Muhammad wa Muhammad. Look at the day of Ashura. Look at the companions of Imam alayhi salam. You'll find that a person like John, who was a servant of Imam Hussein, who died a Christian, there is no conversion story here, died by the side of Imam Hussein as a Christian. Wahab, we know in Karbala, died as a Christian alongside the Imam alayhi salam. And there is no proof in our narrations that they ever converted or there was a conversion story in place. And the Imam accepted them. Matter of fact, after they died, he came and he prayed upon them. He showed them their positions in heaven. One of them was a servant in the house of Imam Ali alayhi salam for many years. And there was no discrimination that to me you are a second-class citizen. Because it's sad in today's world that as a Muslim I come and I preach and I say I'm the lover of Muhammad and Mahdi and Hussein. But there is no position for even a Christian and a Jew in my religion. There's no position for even an atheist in my religion. We shun them away, we move them away. The whole message of Islam is meant to be. And the message of the Prophet was that even people who were alcoholics, he built a system where if someone needs help or if someone wants to be guided, I am here to guide them. There was no, I am ashamed to come and ask, or I'm ashamed to come, I made a mistake. I'll give you a brief example. People would come to the Prophet. One man came to the messenger. Look at how open the Prophet was. It's quite beautiful. How open he was to the people where they can ask him questions. He said, Ya Rasulullah, I have the worst habit. He says, what is it? He says to him, my crimes are so great that God will never forgive me. He starts to weep. He says to him, what did you do? He says to him, Ya Rasulullah, I would dig up bodies of females, dead bodies, and I would have intercourse with their bodies after I have dug up their bodies. Look at how this person is willing to go to the Prophet and talk to him about his deepest concerns. Not only that, a man would come to the messenger and say to him, Ya Rasulullah, I want to commit adultery. His companions come to take out their swords. He says to them, put your swords away. Let me take him for a walk and talk to him. The messenger takes him for a walk, and he says to him, if you had a sister or a mother or a daughter, would you allow somebody to act with her the way you're acting with her? He says, no. He says to him, then what makes you think you have a right to act with this woman the way you want to? Another man comes to the messenger, he says to him, Ya Rasulullah, I love alcohol and I can't give it up. He says to him, what's the next thing in line that you can give up? He says to him, dates. He says to him, give dates away, don't eat dates. He comes to the Prophet days later. He says to him, Ya Rasulullah, not eating dates has strengthened my willpower. I think I can give alcohol up now. The community and the atmosphere and the way that the Prophet made these people was that mistakes and differences were not looked down upon. Matter of fact, they were the stepping stools in order to help these individuals grow later on tomorrow. Look at the culture that we might have created today, which is if you have a mistake, you're ashamed to speak about it. Or if you have a difference of opinion, you can't talk about it. Now that is a culture which was never brought forward by Islam. But what Islam was always preaching was a culture of acceptance, a culture of love, to such a level that a person like Wahshi, who killed the uncle of the Prophet said to him, go, you are now free. I have nothing to do with you. I don't even want to punish you. Now that's a forgiving soul. Perhaps what the verse is saying is not that those who hold on to Islam have advanced, or those who have held on to the actual Islam are the victors. But those who hold on to the true spirit of submission of Islam, those are the individuals who have advanced forward today. Because I tell you, there are sometimes individuals in our society who have not held on to Islam. Now the reason we hold on to Islam is because it's the fastest route to Allah. It's the most complete law system that exists today in its true essence. There are individuals today who have not held on to Islam, but the Muslims have become so slow in some areas that the non-Muslims have very much surpassed us. And it's safe to say at times that the West, or the ungodly world, as corrupt as it can be in certain areas, has advanced so forward in concepts such as basic healthcare. There are basic healthcare, at least in our countries. A person can come here and have basic safety. A person had food, shelter, and water here. A person is able to go to the hospital and get taken care of. A person has the ability to work, to pursue a dream, to pursue something greater. There are Muslim countries today, or countries where there are Muslims which exist, but there is no basic human rights system. People are being butchered left and right. People are being killed here or there. What I'm trying to say is this, is to be godly, take something much greater than simply thinking that if the banner is important, then that's all that matters. Now the question that I ask is this. Look at Hussein ibn Ali alayhi salam. Hussein ibn Ali, sallu ala Muhammad wa ali Muhammad. Hussein ibn Ali is our life vein. He is our jugular vein. He is the air that we breathe. He is the movement which brings us forward. He is what inspires us daily to become greater and greater than we already are. Now imagine the same Hussein ibn Ali. And this is a question to ponder about. It's a theoretical question. Imagine this Hussein ibn Ali. The same Hussein ibn Ali who died for the same cause and lived for the same principles and did the same great things. Imagine that this Hussein ibn Ali was a non-Muslim doing the same things. Would we see him the same way? Now what I'm trying to say here is this, is have we followed Hussein ibn Ali simply for his banner that he's a Muslim? Or have we followed him for the deep message of greatness that he holds as a man himself? Which one of the two have we followed? And this question brings out an interesting reality, that what we follow is not simply banners. What we follow is the truth. Imam Ali says it quite beautifully in Saffin. He looks at his companions, he says to them, don't look at who's saying the truth, but look at what's being said and the truth itself, because that's what matters at the end of the day. And hence Hussein ibn Ali, his movement is quite a profound movement. You'll find that there are so many individuals who are with him. Some who are non-Muslims, like Wahab and John. Some who come from the other side, who came to his side, like Har. Individuals who died by his side at the last moment. The beauty of Imam's army is there's this diversity which exists. There's this acceptance of an individual. A person like her, who does not give the Imam water. He comes to Imam alayhi salam and Imam forgives him immediately. He says to him, Hur, if you repent, then God will accept from you. Other individuals who are in the army of the Imam. Such a diverse army. But I ask you by Allah, if it was not for these open traits, have we ever seen a battle where it's 72 versus 30,000? None of the 72 move over to the 30,000. And many from the 30,000 go to the 72, even though they know the 72 are going to be killed. Have we seen such a battle? What causes such strength? What causes such triumph? Perhaps it's the nature of acceptance. And it's the beauty that Imam alayhi salam has brought forward, that he's allowed the people to live in. And hence it's sad to say that even when he died, the ones who were Muslims and the ones who were non-Muslims were treated equally on the battlefield. Many of them, their bodies were trampled. Many of them, their heads were severed, their heads were cut off. And many of them, their heads were paraded. All of them, their heads were paraded. Not only that, but there was no difference between old and young. You'll find a child, even like Abdullah Ali Asghar, who after the battle, his body is removed from the ground and his head is even severed and put on a spear. Even a young child, as the narrations tell us. What we're saying is the beauty of Karbala is it encompassed all ages. It encompassed all diversities. It encompassed all thought processes, all walks of life. You'll find a person like Habib ibn Mudahir or Muslim ibn Awsaja, men who were old, who their eyebrows would come down to their faces. They had to tie their eyebrows onto their heads because they were so long. Were fighting with the Imam. No two individuals were alike. You've got that person and the youngest, like Al-Qasim alayhi salam, who some narrations say was 12 to 14 years old. Young little boy fighting with the Imam alayhi salam. No two were alike that day. No two had the same thought process. They were on the same principle, the same message, but they were humans. It was okay for them to be different from one to the other, from demographic to the other. That's the beauty of Karbala. The sadness is that after they died, they were all treated the same. No young child was spared. No old person was spared. No young infant was spared. And perhaps the story of Ali al-Asghar is one of the most heartbreaking stories. That Imam Hussein alayhi salam is by the tent standing one day. A lady Zainab comes to Aba Abdullah with a young child in her hand. And she says to him, Brother Aba Abdullah, this young child has not had water in many days. Young child, 3 months old, has not had water in many days. Take him to the army. Perhaps they can give him something to drink. And Aba Abdullah alayhi salam had a habit where if he was going for war, if he was going to fight, he would be on a horse. If he was going to speak to the people, he would go on a camel. On that day, he went on a camel and he sat on his camel and he had the child in his hands. And he stood in front of the army and he says to them, ألا بالخطب الفظيع أنبئوني أنا المذنب أم هذا الرضيع. He says to them, we have come to this great task. Tell me who is a sinner, me or this young child that's in my hand. If you are here to kill me, then by Allah do so. But why should you kill this young child? What has he done? Aba Abdullah raises the child in front of them. As our narrations tell us, he raises him so high, his hands show. Aba Abdullah raises him, saying to them, give him some water to drink. The army split into one side says, give them water. Another side says, لا تبقوا لأهل هذا البيت باقيا. Don't leave one of them alive, kill them all. Umar ibn Sa'd looks at Harmala who was next to him. He says to him, Ya Harmala, and the discussion of the army, saying to him, Ya Harmala, strike the child. Harmala, this is the same man who when Mukhtar sees him, he says to him, Harmala, tell me which one of the 3 arrows hurt you more that you struck in Karbala? Was it the arrow that you struck to the eye of Abu al-Fadl al-Abbas? Was it, Harmala, the arrow that you struck to the liver of Aba Abdullah, to the heart of Aba Abdullah, the 3-pronged arrow? Harmala says to him, Ya Mukhtar, the arrow which struck me the most, which hurt me the most, was the arrow that I threw at young Ali al-Asghar. When I was pointing my bow at him, a wind came and his white neck was exposed. I aimed my bow and I shot my arrow, and the arrow hit the child, and the child removed his arms and he hugged the hands of his father, Aba Abdullah. Imam Hussein then takes the butt of the child and he throws it to the sky, and he says, Oh Allah, may you accept from us. Aba Abdullah takes the child and puts the child under his cloak so that the woman will not see him. The first person who meets Aba Abdullah is Sukaina. Sukaina says to him, Father Hussein, have you given Abdullah water and brought me the remainder? I am thirsty. Her father says to her, daughter, and he removes Abdullah from under his cloak and he gives it to Sukaina. And she says to him in these famous lines, she says to him, boy, الطفل عني تغطي أنا مالي قلب يحسي أنا صديق. She says to him, Father, I can't look at Abdullah in that state. His mother then comes and Lady Zainab gives young Ali al-Asghar to his mother. His mother holds him and she hugs him. She says to him, my dear son, I had plans to see you grow older. I had plans to see you married tomorrow. This is the same woman who, when she left Karbala, she looks at the caravan leader and says to him, oh caravan leader, do not leave. I have left a young infant in Karbala. Inna lillahi wa inna ilayhi raji'un. وسيعلم الذين ظلموا آل محمد أي منقلب ينقلبون والعاقبة للمتقين يا Allah. Let's raise our hands towards Allah Azza wa Jalla and recite Aman Yujibu 5 times together, and Ya Allah 11 times, all of us together in the loudest of voices. Bismillahir Rahmanir Rahim. Allahumma salli ala Muhammadin wa ali Muhammad. بسم الله الرحمن الرحيم. أمن يجيب المضطر إذا دعا ويكشف السوء. 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 يا الله 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 يا Allah. Oh Allah, heal all of our sick ones, Ya Allah. Keep us on the path of Muhammad, Ya Allah. Make us leaders in our communities, Ya Allah. ويرحم المؤمنين والمؤمنات والمسلمين والمسلمات. نقرأ سورة المباركة الفاتحة تسبقها صلوات. اللهم صل على محمد.